All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Jenny Hughes. Jenny, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So Jenny is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in the treatment of trauma and PTSD. As a clinician, she practices EMDR, cognitive processing therapy, and prolonged exposure therapy. Jenny recently published a workbook designed for clients to use on their own or with their therapist called the PTSD Recovery Workbook, which can be found on Amazon. Through her clinical work, Jenny discovered that her true passion is to support other trauma therapists through the inevitable experience of vicarious trauma. While trauma work is incredibly rewarding, Jenny knew therapists making space for this healing deserve to be cared for too. This inspired her to create the Brave Trauma Therapist Collective, a membership site that helps trauma therapists go from feeling drained, demoralized, to energized and empowered. Members of Brave work with Jenny to become more aware of how to name VT, develop realistic ways to tame VT, and ultimately reframe it by thriving in their professional and personal lives. Well said. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So before we get going here, share with the listeners where you are from originally and where you are currently.
Yeah. So originally I'm from Colorado. I was raised in a little mountain town just west of Boulder, and then lived there until I was about 25 and then went to the West Coast for grad school.
Okay.
And then came to New Orleans for internship and stayed on there. And New Orleans stole my heart and soul.
Wow.
And then now I'm in Houston and moved here to be with my now husband and the family that we have. So that's kind of my journey all across the western half of the United States.
Awesome. All right. So let's get going here. How the heck did you get into this field?
I mean, I think a lot of it is me search. I was one of those weird people who the first day of undergrad knew that I was going to declare psychology. And I decided that I was going to go heal all of the substance abusing adolescents because that's what, had been doing right before starting college. Grew up with other substance stuff in my family too. And so that's where I thought I was going.
Mm-hmm.
And I continued that thread of psychology, but once I finished undergrad, I started working with kids in foster care. And that took me really focusing on the trauma aspect of it, which there was still that thread connecting it to substance use because that's often a part of trauma and abuse for kids. But then I really fell in love with the trauma work. And I also had to acknowledge to myself that I wasn't cut out to do substance use work. I couldn't have enough my own personal boundaries around that. My own biases would get in the way too much. And
say more about that. What do you mean?
My dad was an addict and he never got better. I have other family members in my family who never got better. And I know that people get better from substance abuse and use, but those were really critical experiences for me growing up and really important relationships that were tattered in a lot of ways. And even doing my own work around it, it still is just this nagging thing in the back of my mind. And so I set that professional boundary for myself.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to go back just a bit. So you had this theme of substance abuse in your family running. Was that conscious when you decided to move into psychology?
Oh yeah,
Okay,
it
it
was very
was.
much, I'm going to fix myself through other teenagers who are using and
Okay.
abusing substances.
Okay.
Because I went through my own, experiences of that. I was fortunately never developed any addiction, but definitely was using substances in risky ways.
Hmm.
And so I was able to, move out of that, and wanted to then give back to kids like that. But I think really it was an immature desire to learn more about myself at that time in my life as an 18, 19-year-old kid. So,
All right. So I want you to talk more, if you would, about the foster care experience. And you said trauma is obviously apparent there. Can you share with us some specific examples of what you were seeing and how that was impacting you? How that,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, actually, right behind me, this mosaic is from one of the first kids I ever worked with in a clinical manner. So I was working for the Boulder Mental Health Center and I was a youth advocate. So it was like a clinical mentor. And so I was working with kids in the community, but also like in their homes and lots of just like really in the trenches work. And the kid that made this for me, I think, really set me on the course of the rest of my career without knowing it. But she had gone from, she lived, I think she actually came from Texas, but she lived out of state. She had gone through multiple residential homes, group homes, all the things. She fortunately, once she got to Colorado, she had a couple of rocky like placements, but then she got into a therapeutic foster care home. And her foster parents were amazing and they were so supportive, so validating, and were able to hold her pain with her.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that was my first foray into working with kids in foster care. Not all the kids in that job that I worked with were in care, but she certainly imprinted on me and set the stage for a lot of the research I would do later around mentoring kids in foster care that I then did at the Kemp Center in Denver, where we were looking at just the healing role of relationships for kids and for kids in
Mm-hmm.
care. And that question of, is it really true that, one or two adults can change the course of a kid's life, even a kid who's had so much trauma that they are no longer in the home of their biological parents?
Oh,
And the short
okay.
answer was yes, from what we were finding in that study. But that was, and then I've worked with other kids in foster care doing TFCBT in homes, doing child parent psychotherapy, and being able to work with the kid and their parents has been, I think, the culminating experience, to be able to see the healing in the child parent relationship with the
Mm-hmm.
child and the parent from whom they've been removed.
Mm-hmm. When you started working with that kid or other kids, for example, and you started as a young clinician learning about trauma, I mean, that can be pretty intense in and of itself, right? What was that like for you? Because I mean, let's face it. I mean, that's why you created this program, to help other therapists deal with it. What was that like for you, learning about this trauma and seeing it in these kids and saying to yourself, how did that come about? I want to do this. I want to help these kids.
It, I mean, so it's funny because at the time when I was at the Boulder Mental Health Center, certainly we talked about trauma, but we really, as an approach, took a strength-based approach. And
Mm-hmm.
so as a team, we took a strength-based approach, and it was such a healthy experience within an organization to really feel held and truly supported by our leadership within our team and the organization, and to know that I could do this work, that they really had my back. And I think that unconsciously set the stage for what I would expect from other organizations, which didn't always follow through with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though we were doing this tough work, and in-home work is hard,
Yeah.
that's a whole other level of experiencing your clients. But it was the best work that I think I've ever done. I didn't know anything. I didn't know what I
Mm-hmm.
was doing. I was still in college. I wasn't trained, I was just like hanging out with kids, but had these amazing clinicians guiding me in very subtle ways and helping me to learn about boundaries and how to support myself within the framework they were providing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, that's interesting. You said they were guiding you in subtle ways. What did you learn about boundaries for yourself? Because very oftentimes it's really easy for inexperienced or new clinicians to um, maybe look through or beyond or past those boundaries in the name of trying to help, you know?
Yeah, so my supervisor, her name was Marnie. She actually gave me another thing on there, and it's a quote.
Well, wait,
But
what does that quote say? Do you
so
want to
let me
read it?
see.
It's got to be good if it's on
It
your.
says, 100 years from now, it will not matter what kind of car I drove, what kind of house I lived in, how much I had in my bank account, nor what my clothes looked like. But the world may be a better place because I was important in the life of a child. And then it has a little penny in there just to say, like, none of that shit matters.
Mm-hmm.
And she always reined in my superwoman. She always was like, Jenny, you are not superwoman, and you don't have to be superwoman. You can actually
Mm-hmm.
do better work when you're not trying to be superwoman. And so that was when I first learned about, like, not, taking phone calls at 1 a.m. or because that wasn't my job. I wasn't a crisis, person.
Right.
And just not working harder than my clients too, and their families sometimes.
Yeah. Wow, that's pretty cool. It reminds me of a story that when I was working as a therapist in a school, it was one of my first placements. And it was a school for kids who were on the spectrum. They had other behavioral issues. And I was working with this young kid, and he must have been like 10 or 11. And here I was, in grad school, and at the same time going through sensory motor psychotherapy training. And I was, trying so hard to intervene and use these techniques. And even when we were outside throwing the baseball around and the football around, that wasn't enough for me, right? I had to do all this other stuff. And I was so frustrated because he wouldn't talk or blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the year, when the kids in the school basically were saying goodbye to the therapist, he handed me this collage of photographs. I don't know how the heck he got them, but it was of him and me, and he framed it.
Wow.
And on the back of it, he wrote this note that said, dear Mr. Guy, I want to thank you so much for helping me. Even though it seemed like I was never listening, I was always listening.
Wow. Oh
I
my
was like,
God.
oh
Did you
my,
like die in that
I
moment?
died, and I still die. How, like, I just felt so incompetent. But anyway, what you're saying and what you're sharing really is making me think about how important it is, like, to you, that your supervisor was like trying to take away your super,
Mm-hmm.
and just you're enough,
Yeah. And I think that those years as early clinicians, I think that's truly some of the best work that we ever do. Not only am I in private practice and stuff, but I also work in a medical school, and we just wrapped up with our interns. And so I had my last supervision with them this week, and they were sharing spontaneously just about the feedback that they'd gotten from their clients. And similar, a couple of them, they were really surprised by, the positive feedback and the praise that they got from them. And one of my interns said that there was actually someone she worked with at the beginning of the year who reached out, and she thought this person just kind of dropped off and, like, I don't know what happened to them. They reached out, emailed her an update, and said the work that we did was so important and
Wow.
really was life-changing. And my intern was like, what is, like, I don't think I did anything with them, right? And
Right.
so I think that, yeah, that early work that we do, we are so open, we're so curious, and we crave so much. And so I think that really shines through with our patients and clients. And then having space with supervisors and mentors
Mm-hmm.
to process and to balance that, I think, is one of the greatest gifts.
What are you doing in the medical school
I do clinical work and supervision
for
for trauma and PTSD.
the interns, medical school interns?
No, so it's a academic medical school, so they're there for internship,
I
and
see.
I'm supervising them.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So, how did things unfold for you professionally Um, take us there on that journey, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned that our careers don't unfold the way we think that they will, because then, I very intentionally pursued working with kids and trauma. And I loved doing that. And even when I was on internship, I got the opportunity to be trained with 0 to 5, learning CPP, which I'd never worked with kids that young, and realized how rewarding that was. It was so amazing. And
And remind our
then
listeners what CPP is.
yeah, so child parent psychotherapy, and it is developed by Alicia Lieberman, and she's at UCSF, and it is an intervention for really young children and babies and their parents, a dyadic intervention to treat trauma for really little kids. And I did a postdoc on 0 to 5 stuff. And then when I became faculty at LSU, they needed, to pay for my salary somehow. And so all of a sudden I started working at the Level 1 Trauma Center. And I was so blessed to be able to build our trauma psychology program there. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. Like working at the bedside and working with the whole trauma team, and every day was different. And so then all of a sudden I was working with all adults. Wow. And I'd always worked with kids and families. But that was where my career took me, and I wasn't going to fight it. And I was loving it.
That sounds like a really rich and intense experience working in that capacity.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it is. And we were so fortunate that psychology and psychiatry are really valued at that hospital. And I think culturally in New Orleans, trauma is part of the weave of that culture. And so there's not as much education about trauma and trauma-informed care and the importance of identifying it. Like, it was just like, yeah, of course there's trauma. Let's do something about it. And so again, it was a situation where I felt supported, where I felt like, we were all on the same team.
So you seem to have a unique experience and perspective. And I think probably a good person to answer this next question. What do you see that newer clinicians who are coming into the field, who are interested in trauma, what do you see or how would you guide them to get into the field, to learn about this?
So the first step is just saying, I want to work with someone who wants to do trauma work. So I say it in that way because we've all experienced some kind of a trauma, whether it's big T or little t, and it's all valid, but not everyone's coming to therapy to do work on their traumas. And so the place that I would want to start, and that I like to start with my trainees, is, okay, let's find someone who really wants to do that trauma work, so you can walk them through the treatment and see that recovery is so possible, and so that you can experience the arc of that recovery with this person, because that's one of the things that ultimately fills up your cup. I think trauma work can feel, and so often as a trauma therapist, people are like, oh, I don't know how you can do that work. And so then that feels very isolating and alone for me, when I'm like, no, I do it every day because I see people get better. I see people overcome and thrive despite all of the stuff that's happened.
And in terms of like modalities, how do you guide people? What do you say to them? Where do I start?
Well, with trainees or with the clients?
Yeah, with the trainees.
I think that in the trauma world, I think it's really helpful to get trained in at least 1 or 2 trauma treatments. So, because it's that talking about feeling ineffective again, with trauma, we have treatments that work. And so if we can skill up our clinicians and let them know this is a really strong framework for you with all of these skills, and even step by step, then they are going to feel much more confident going into session with their clients, knowing that I can sit with this, I can hold this space with you, and I can help you take the steps forward. So I love doing EMDR. I also really like cognitive processing experiencing therapy, even though I was never trained CBT. I was trained very psychodynamically, but I think it takes a very gentle approach to cognitive work as it relates to trauma, and it makes sense to people, especially people for whom their beliefs about the world have been shattered. And it's not so much that they're bothered by the memories, but it's just that they just can never see the world the same, but they know that there's something better. And so I think getting training for a new clinician in a trauma treatment is really beneficial, because then you can spread your wings and you can add your own twist to things, but you have such a strong foundation.
Right. So with the plethora of treatment modalities out there, do you just say basically, try something, learn something, or do you try to guide them to be in a more specific way? In other words, does it matter? Because there are people listening to this going, and people have emailed me, Guy, where the hell do I start?
Well, for me, in terms of my own comfort, I feel comfortable training CPT, prolonged exposure. Those are really the two that I feel comfortable teaching people how to use. I can absolutely support people in EMDR after they've done their own basic training, but I think that and like somatic experiencing, I think it's important to really do the formal training there. And then certainly, so when people, and to answer your question, I think for me, I want to be working within my own scope, right? Within my own scope of practice. And yet, when we're talking about a trauma-informed lens and approach to the work, I think that is throughout. And so modeling how to reframe things as trauma when someone is really minimizing it, how to, help to validate those experiences when they've never felt supported. So there's the more formalized training piece that I like to do, but then also the modeling of how do we just acknowledge that trauma is part of everyone's life and experience.
Right. Okay. So your membership, the Brave Trauma Therapist Collective, how did that come about?
So that came about, I've been talking about very positive experiences that I've had within organizations, but there's been really difficult ones as well, where, a lot of our systems out there are broken themselves, unfortunately, and are doing their best to provide care to their patients. But I call it a traumatized system of care, that system is running on empty and is in survival mode in and of itself. And so then I think the people that work within it just gets transferred to them. And so, vicarious trauma is this occupational hazard for many helping professionals, trauma therapists in particular, but it doesn't necessarily have to knock you down. If you have the right kind of support, the right community, the right place to be able to talk about your work and to feel seen and heard.
So how would you define, or how do you define vicarious trauma?
Yeah, so I use the term vicarious trauma very specifically for trauma therapists and helping professionals, but I reserve it for people that are helping professionals, because the way that I interpret and use it is the stress and trauma we're soaking up from the people that we're caring for, from the people that we are working with and helping to heal. There's also secondary traumatic stress, which anyone could experience. Like after the Uvalde shooting, I freaked out and started a Facebook group and did all this stuff because I was experiencing secondary traumatic stress from that, thinking about my own children. Then there's compassion fatigue, right? Where we just are feeling like we don't have any more compassion and care to give to the people that we're taking care of as professionals. And then there's burnout, where we leave and we're just done.
So basically we're all screwed. How do you personally manage it?
So first and foremost is through my professional relationships. I think especially doing trauma work, we sign up for something very, very special, but also something that most people don't sign up for. And so HIPAA aside, I'm not going to talk to my husband about my work because he's not a trauma therapist. He didn't want to do that. And only other people that are in this profession with me can really understand. And can I share this without being worried that I am harming them? Because I know that we're sharing space together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me ask you this question, and I ask this of a lot of my guests here. Can you share an early clinical error? And I want you to try to be specific if you can.
Any clinical error as it relates to vicarious trauma?
Well, as if it relates to trauma, that would be good.
Mm-hmm. The first that just came to mind was, again, working at the Boulder Mental Health Center. One of my clients was in crisis a lot. And I lived like 20 or 30 minutes outside of Boulder up in the mountains. And one night, it was that 1 a.m. phone call I talked about earlier. She called me and I answered, and she was at the bus station in Boulder. And like totally suicidal, like such a crisis situation. And I got up and I drove down and I got her. And thank God everyone was okay, right? Like nothing terrible happened. But that was a huge error on my part, just in terms of like liability and boundaries, but also the message that I was sending to her, that you need to be rescued, that you don't have the resources to be able to take the steps that we've talked about prior to this, to be able to care for yourself. But it also was one where I was met with understanding and compassion from my supervisor, and I wasn't shamed, and we were able to talk about it, fortunately. And so I could learn from it and not have to kind of do the run and hide and pretend like it never happened.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. That's a tough one. I mean, a lot of us get into this field because we want to help, but that's such a charged word and it can be defined so many ways. But I want to get back to the Brave Trauma Therapist Collective. So you shared that it came about from some not so positive experiences. So continue sharing with us how that came about, what you did, how you formed it.
Yeah, so I wanted to create a community for trauma therapists, because we tend to be quite siloed, either within like clinics that specialize in trauma, or a lot of private practice folks that do trauma work, but maybe don't have other trauma therapists that they're able to talk to.
Right.
And not in terms of training or consultation, but just have a relationship with, and just like understand we're in this together. And so through Brave, we're able to create that space, both through our community online and monthly Zoom calls where we can all get together and just kind of talk about what it's like. And also, I take time to be able to teach about vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, all that good stuff within our community, so that we have a shared language, and so that we have, each month a shared goal that we're all working on together, so that we can be cheering for each other, holding each other accountable, and also, holding each other up when one of us is really struggling.
Right. Okay. So we'll have that Brave Trauma Therapist Collective linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. You can also access it via your website. Is that braveproviders.com?
Yes.
Okay. Braveproviders.com. So as we kind of wind down here, what do you suggest for therapists to, I guess, number one, how can they be aware of vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, number one, and number two, how can they, I guess, protect themselves, if I can use that word?
Yeah, well, and awareness is the most important thing, because VT, it'll come and sneak up on you. Even when you think everything's going okay, all of a sudden, whether it is a particular case or it's been something that has been, kind of filling up your cup over time, and all of a sudden it boils over. And so things to look out for me in particular, is irritability and isolating. Everyone pisses me off and I don't want to hang out with anyone. So those are my like personal kind of, red flags to start off with. But then there also, I mean, it can get to that point of feeling so much despair about your work that like you dread seeing your clients, you're not answering like phone calls and emails. You are thinking about leaving, that's the very tail end of it that I don't want people to get to. I want to acknowledge that those thoughts happen. I've had those thoughts, and hopefully prevent some of that. And so getting to the prevention piece, one is naming it, is just saying, okay, this is what VT looks like for me. And it's not about taking bubble baths and doing yoga to take care of yourself either. It's, okay, am I brushing my teeth? Am I doing my activities of daily living that I need? Do I have the foundational stuff for myself? And then maybe I can start to add some additional things on, starting with, maybe yoga, like for me, it is something that's great. I'm not always able to do it because I don't have the bandwidth. And so not judging myself for saying I'm not good enough because I didn't go to yoga this week. Right. So it's such an individual experience, but I don't want to sugarcoat it. I don't want to say the bubble baths are going to fix it. I think talking about it and just being in community together is the most healing.
Now, in terms of a therapist's own inner work or work or being in therapy themselves, where does that come into play with this?
It definitely comes into play. I think depending on the person and where they are in life. So I was talking to a friend about this recently. For myself, it has been hard to find a therapist that I felt like really understood me. And some of that's my own sort of internal stuff, right? But it also is hard if they're not also a trauma therapist, that guilt comes back of like, oh, can I really talk to them about this? Like, they don't do trauma work. They chose not to do trauma work. So what do I have to censor myself?
Right.
And so it's interesting because we know how hard it is for anyone to get mental health care. And then when we experience that, it's really humbling and eye-opening. And I think it has led me to value therapy even more so for myself, and also honoring that it's not always accessible for everyone at every moment in their life.
Awesome. You have such a rich experience. I love it. I mean, I think you're in such a great position to mentor other trauma therapists and share your experiences of vicarious trauma and burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And I love the way you named all those things. You just rattled off your tongue so easily. Let me ask you this. What do you feel is inside of you that allows you to do this work?
I think it's similar to the thing that lets me do trauma work with my clients is I know that it heals. I know that through community together, we are able to heal, and to keep doing the work that we love and the work that empowers us. Right. I feel like, and a word that I use a lot is like, I'm a badass trauma therapist. Like, it's really cool being a trauma therapist, but it's also really tiring at times. And so I'm able to do this because I know when I'm with other trauma therapists that we fuel each other.
That's awesome. All right, Jenny, how about a go-to book recommendation, whether trauma related or not? What do you look like you have something right there?
I do. So Trauma Stewardship.
Oh yeah.
So we're in the free Facebook group that I have. It's just called the Brave Vicarious Trauma Community, and it's for any kind of helping professional. We're doing a book club on trauma stewardship right now. So we're going through it chapter by chapter, which is really awesome. I really needed to reread it. It's one of those books that you have to come back to. Like any of the work in VT, you always have to be coming back. And Laura just does, her writing style is so accessible, and she is just speaking to your soul. It's not like clinical jargony, and yet it meets clinicians where they're at in terms of their level of education. So
awesome. So that's Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, right? Right. She was past guest on this podcast. Awesome. All right. So you are, once again, your website is braveproviders.com.
Yep.
Dr. Jennifer Hughes, I want to thank you so much for being on this podcast. Is that the best way for people to get in touch with you, your website?
Yep. Yep. So they can go to the website, excuse me. And right now it'll go to get my free vicarious trauma tracker, which is really helpful. And then there's the contact page. I'm still working on building out the other pieces of the website.
Awesome.
Sometimes you have to build the plane while flying it. But yes, and they can contact me directly through there.
Awesome. Well, it was a pleasure having you on here and meeting you, and super inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. This has been a pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.